Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. A couple of weeks ago, the Governor of the Bank of England here in London, Andrew Bailey, was testifying to the UK House of Commons, and he described the impending global food crisis as, I quote, apocalyptic. Well, some in the British press thought that he was exaggerating and veering on the somewhat apocalyptic side, but he's been borne out in his warnings in recent days by several other leading international officials too. For example, the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, was just yesterday speaking in Davos at the World Economic Forum and described how rising food and fuel bills are tipping 12 countries into poverty and also into political violence. Last week, David Beasley, the executive director of the UN World Food Programme, was speaking to the United Nations Security Council, and he described how already 1.6 billion people in the world are suffering from food stress. That's up 440 million in just 2 years. He spoke about how 49 million have been added to the 276 million who are suffering from extreme malnutrition, and also of the 49 million in 43 countries of the world who are in danger of impending famine. Indeed, in East Africa, a place of prolonged drought and food scarcity, somebody dies every 48 seconds. So what is provoking this global food crisis? Well, unsurprisingly, and first and foremost, the war in Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine together supply 28% of global wheat and maize, about 80% of sunflower oil, and together they supply 50 countries in the world. Ukraine alone supplies calories to 440 million people in the world. And so clearly the fact that that grain is not getting to market because of the war, 25 million tons of grain are stuck in Ukrainian silos. They can't be exported because of the Russian blockade of Black Sea ports, which of course also have been mined by Ukraine too. But beyond that, the war has led to destruction of a lot of grain. Farmers have gone off to fight and are therefore not planting their future crops either. And so that is one of the most immediate causes that we need to address. But as always with a crisis, it's not just one factor, but it's the interplay of several. For example, we also have the COVID-19 impact, which has disrupted global supply chains, made it harder for farmers to get pesticides and fertilizer. Also, many poor countries have suffered from a lack of tourism, which has deprived them of foreign currency, which they normally use also to buy food. Sri Lanka, for instance, has run out of foreign exchange completely, can no longer import anything, and the domestic turmoil is there for everybody to see. The fuel crisis with rising gas prices doesn't help either, because much of fertilizer is produced from gas, particularly nitrates, and gas has gone up by 4 times, putting pressure on farmers. Climate change also is playing an increasingly important role. The UK Met Office calculates that extreme heat that we have been seeing recently is 100 times more likely than 100 years ago. For example, last March, India suffered the hottest March on record. That led to India, which hitherto had promised to feed the world, to suddenly reverse course and announce a shutdown of grain exports, although it has opened up a little chink in the armor last week by concluding an agreement with Egypt to supply that country with 500,000 tons of grain. But currently, 26 countries in the world are imposing some kind of grain export restrictions, and that is 15% of all global calories. So what can we do to try to remedy this situation before we experience famine on a biblical scale? Well, obviously, first and foremost, to try to get Ukraine's grain to market. The UN Secretary General is trying to mediate to see if we can open the port of Odessa, a kind of humanitarian grain corridor in the Black Sea. policy. Russian opposition may make that unlikely, but the EU can look at, for example, using the Danube or also removing restrictions on Ukrainian trucks like customs duties so that we can transport some of the grain by road. Not a perfect solution, but better than nothing at all. We also need to ask countries like China, which have hoarded grain. In fact, China is credited with having about 600 million tons of it, to open up their grain silos, distribute globally, and help to bring the price down. The next thing that we have to do is to get trade flowing so that markets can operate. 4/5 of the world population live in countries which import their food. And therefore, the fact that we have 26 countries currently that are putting restrictions on grain exports is interfering with those vital market mechanisms. We need to look to debt forgiveness. That's inevitable because unless countries can direct debt to buying grain, they are not going to be able to afford the much higher prices that we're seeing at the moment. Finally, we need to take a look at all of the grain which is currently used not to feed human beings, but to feed cattle or pigs, or to produce biofuels. For example, in 2021, China imported a staggering 28 million tons of grain just to feed its pigs. And 10% of all grain also goes to produce biofuels. Now, this may make sense in terms of environmental conversion, but in this crisis, we can ill afford to be in this situation because it's been calculated by the United Nations that all of the grain devoted to animal feed and to biofuels would in fact feed 1.9 billion people. That's about a quarter of the world's population. So it's useful in the EU that countries like Finland and Croatia have led the way by changing laws to enable grain to be redistributed from biofuels and animal feed to human consumption. And that, at least on a temporary basis, has got to be the shape of things to come. The bottom line is that there is indeed enough food in the world to feed everybody on the planet. And food production, it has increased until recently, at least, because of better yields, better fertilizers, more scientific approaches to food production, better use of water, and so on and so forth. The problem, however, is that all of the food is with the haves and not with the have-nots. And getting, therefore, the food redistributed on a more equitable scale very quickly is going to be urgent if we are to stave off a major planetary catastrophe. Thank you very much for watching and listening this week. Hope to engage with you very soon. Bye for now.